Hello there, everybody. We have lots of exciting stuff planned today. Today we're going to be showing you how to build this animated bouquet chart using Svelte, SVG, and a little bit of D3. I came up with this design as a way to showcase lots of different data attributes in a way that was still pretty easy to read. So without further ado, let's get started. The first thing that we're going to need is a blank Svelte app. You could either make one by going to svelte.dev and clicking on the REPL like I did, or alternatively create one in your terminal using npm create vite at latest. Give your project a name. Let's just do project. We're going to be using Svelte and then JavaScript. CD into that folder, so cd project, npm install, and then npm run dev. Now that our app is set up, we're going to need some data. In the description in my GitHub, I've linked to some mock data that I used, or alternatively bring some data yourself. You can start by creating a new file, which we're going to call data.js. You can write export default, and then paste in your data. Once it's all set, switch back to your main app, clear out whatever they give you by default, create a new script tag, and then import data from, and then the file path, so data.js. Now that that's set, we're going to start our chart by creating scales. Scales in D3 you can think of as a sort of formula, where you give it a piece of data and then your output is something that you want to show on the screen. So for example, let's give it an X value of 10. That could then translate to 50 pixels. Using these, we're able to attach SVG elements to data and create our charts. In our bouquet chart over here, we have 4 different scales. We have an X scale, we have a Y scale, we have a scale to determine the size of the bubbles, and then we have a scale to determine the color of the bubbles. The way we're going to start these is by importing scale linear from D3-scale. There's lots of different types of scales in D3. Scale linear is one that scales proportionally to what you give it. So giving it a value of 1 will lead to a result of 1. Giving it a value of 2 will lead to a result of 2. Let's first do our X scale. So const X scale equals scale linear, domain, and then range. With our X scale, this is going to be the way that we place our elements horizontally on the page. Since domain is relative to our data, we're going to give it the range of values that we want to work with. We're going to do 0, and then we're going to do the length of our data. This means that if, let's say we have 10 elements, we can place these 10 elements evenly across the x-axis. The range is now going to be the range of values that we have on our screen, and to do that we need to establish a height and a width. To start out, let's give it a width of 800, and then we'll give it a height of 600, and then we can go back and adjust these later. You'll often find that a lot of the elements on your chart will bump up against the borders, so we're going to create some margins. For now, we're going to set that at 0, but later on we're going to add some numbers in there to help pad these against the edges. So let's do const margins equals top 0, right 0, bottom 0, and left 0. Without the margins, our range would be something like 0 to the width of the chart. But because we're going to want to go back and add padding later, we're going to do this as margins left to width minus margins right. So when we eventually set this left value, it'll pad the scale a little bit from the left side, and same with the right. Now that those dimensions are established, let's move on by creating our other scales. We're going to want to scale for the y-axis, we're going to want to scale for the size of the bubbles, and a scale for the color of the bubbles. Starting out with y, this is going to be tied to the height element inside of our data. Let's change this over to y scale, and we want the domain to be the minimum height value in our data and the maximum height value in our data. D3 comes with a function called extent, which will grab the min and the max value of an array of data. So if we take extent, we put that over here, and then we give it the height values, which we can get by doing data.map d and then d.height. And since the X scale covers our horizontal values, we want to change the Y scale to cover our vertical ones. However, this setup is going to be a little bit different. The interesting thing with SVG is that Y0 is up here, whereas Y600 is going to be down here. If a height is a high number, we actually want the Y value to be low because it will appear higher on the screen. That means that the range of our Y scale is going to be inverted. We're going to do the higher numbers at the bottom and we're going to do the lower numbers at the top. So for our first value, we're going to do height minus margins bottom, which will give us the value down here. To get the value at the top, we're just going to do margins top. The way this works, if we log our Y scale, if we do console.log Y scale, and then give it a value toward the upper end of our height range, so let's say 50, it will actually give it quite a low number in return. But if we give it a lower number, like 10, it'll give it a higher number. That means that the higher height will have a lower y value, thus appearing higher on the screen. But a lower height will have a higher y value and thus appear lower. Moving on to our size scale, that's going to be tied to the value key inside of our data. Let's copy the setup for the y scale, except let's change the name to size scale so we don't get confused, and then switch out this height for the value. The range is now going to be the range of size that we want that bubble to be. Let's start out with 10 and 50, but we can always adjust this later on. Our final scale is going to be the color scale. We're also going to have this tied to the value attribute, so larger bubbles will appear a little bit darker, but let's say that you have another key in your data, you could also just adjust it to use that instead. If we change the name to color scale, and this time instead of giving it numbers, we're actually going to give it hex colors. We're going to have our lowest value be pure white, and then we're going to have our highest value be red. This will build a gradual color scale based off of whatever you give it. So if we take color scale and give it a value, it will give it a color somewhere between pure white and red. Now that our math is all set up, let's begin working with some SVGs. Below your script tag, we're going to add a div. And then inside of that, let's add an SVG tag. That SVG tag is going to take a height and a width, which we already established above. The first thing we're going to add are our circles. Let's start with the G tag, which is like the SVG equivalent of a div. And in Svelte, we're going to map over our data by doing each, data, point, I, and as. Point is going to be the actual value in the data array, and then I is going to be the index of that value. We're going to need that index because we're using our X scale, which uses the index and not anything about the actual data. Let's close off this each, and then make another G tag. You could just use a circle here, but we're going to add a lot of things like text and shadows, and it's going to be helpful to group this all together. Let's create a circle, and that circle is going to take a few things. It's going to take a center X, it's going to take a center Y, it's going to take a radius, and then a fill color. The center X is our X scale, so let's do X scale, and then give it our index. The center Y is going to be that Y position, so Y scale, and that is tied to height, so point.height. R is the size of the bubble, it's the radius, and that is tied to point.value, and then uses our size scale. And then fill uses our color scale and is also tied to value. Although it is very exciting that we have bubbles, you're going to find a couple of issues. The first is that we're missing some of these. That's because our minimum value is set to white. Therefore, if it has the lowest possible value, that bubble is white, and on a white background that wouldn't show up. So let's change that lowest to more of a pink. The next thing you'll find is that some of our bubble placement is a little bit dramatic. We're going to try reducing the height by adding some bottom margin, and then also add some margin on the sides so nothing's getting cut off. We could just drop the height value here, but we're going to need that later for the stems of the flowers. So let's add a bottom margin of around 300. Let's add a right of 400. Not too much. Let's try 100. And then a left of 100 as well. And we'll do about 50 on the top. That's looking pretty good. The next thing we're going to do is make the bubbles shiny. Looking back at our original chart, we can see these have a reflection coming on the upper right, and the way that we're going to do this is by using a radial gradient. Radial gradients look like this. It's basically moving between two colors but in a circular pattern, and it might be a little bit confusing how this will get to our shine, but we will show you in a minute. To do the radial gradient, we're going to go inside of the SVG element. We're going to do radial gradient, and it's going to take two colors or stops. So stop, and then another stop. The stops are the two colors that we want to move between. And we can set this by doing stop color. And just for demonstration, we're going to do this black, and then our other stop color is going to be white. Now we're going to give our stop an offset. Offsets indicate where that color begins. If it's 100%, it means that on the very outside of the circle, so 100% of the radius, it will be pure black. To see what our radial gradient will look like, let's create a new circle. And this is actually going to overlay our original circles. This is because down the road, when we try to make it look like it's shining, it's going to be a bit translucent, so you can see the original color through it. Let's switch out the value to URL, hashtag, and then we'll do radial gradient. This points to the ID of an element, so let's give this an ID. And here we could see how our radial gradient is working. The very outside at 100% is black, the interior is white. The way that we start to make this look like a reflection is that we're going to set both of these to white, and we're going to use something called stop opacity. We want the very outside of our gradient to be almost translucent so we can see the bubble color through it. But we want the interior to be white so it obscures a little bit of the bubble color. So let's start with an opacity of 0. And then we're going to end with an opacity of 0.7. We can now change the placement of this reflection so it looks like it's coming from here. If we do Cx equals 90% and then Cy equals 10%. Let's add the text labels now. We're going to create another G tag. I like to place text inside of a G tag because I find that setting the transform in the G tag is a lot more convenient than setting the X and Y inside of text. Let's give it a text. And that's going to take the label key in our data. So if we do point and then label, we can see these are all bunched up in the corner, so we're going to want to translate them to their corresponding bubble location. We're going to do transform, then translate. Here we're going to use our X and our Y scale to place them properly. So let's do X scale and then Y scale. X scale, like the circle, will take X scale then the index, and then Y scale will take the height. We can see that these are all off center, so let's fix that by doing dominant baseline, middle. This will place it correct vertically, and then we'll do text anchor, also middle. The text is kind of big. We're going to use some CSS to fix that. Class equals label. And below your div tag, you can add style, label. We'll do font size 0.6 rem, a little bit bigger than that, 0.7. We'll make the color white. And because of the white background, it's kind of hard to see, so we'll add some text shadow to help it stand out. We'll do 0, 1 pixel, 2 pixels, RGBA 000.6. Font isn't great looking. Let's switch that over to Futura, or your font of choice. Let's also make our bubbles bigger to prevent these from overflowing so much. We're going to up this to 20, and maybe we'll make our max 60. The next part will be our stems, but before building those, let's talk about Bezier curves. The way these curves work is that we have a start point, and then we have an end point, and then we have 2 additional points to help guide the curvature of that line. We can see by placing it here, it pulls the belly of the line a bit in that direction, and then having one here pulls it in that direction. The line that we're going for is similar to this, but we want it to be symmetrical. So instead of placing this over here, we're going to place it right about over there. So we need a start point, an end point, a point halfway down at the end of the y-axis, and then a point halfway down at the beginning of the y-axis. Let's create a function called curvyLine. That will take a x1, a y1, an x2, and a y2. That is where you want your line to start and where you want your line to end. That will return m, which means move, to the start of the line, so x1, y1, and finish at where we want the end of the line, so x2, y2. Let's create our path and take a look. So path. The D is going to be the position of where we draw the path, and we're going to leverage our curvyLine function. The x1 and the y1 is going to be the same for every single line, which is about the middle of the chart. So we'll do width divided by 2, and then a height of the very bottom. The x2 and the y2 will be the position of the bubble. So x scale index, and then y scale height. We'll give the path a stroke so we can see it. Base might be a little bit low, so let's reduce the height a tad. Much better. We also want the lines to be thicker, so stroke width equals, try 10. There we are. To turn these into curved lines, we need to add those anchor points here. We can do that to the SVG path by adding a C, and this will take the first anchor point followed by the second anchor point. As we discussed, we want that first anchor point to be about halfway up the height at the beginning of the y-axis. Since we're going for here in the beginning, let's take our first x value. And the next thing we want is halfway up on our y value. The way that we can get this is by doing y2 minus y1 over 2. And if you remember, we added some padding on the bottom to prevent those stems from going all the way down here. So we want to make sure to add that value back in, so plus y1. For the second one, we can copy the same formula, except now that this is going to be further on the right side, let's use x2. Then make sure to add a comma. And while we're at it, let's fix our spelling mistakes here. To prevent these from looking boat-like, we can give the fill none. And we have our stems. Instead of keeping the stroke color at black, let's try to have it match the color of the bubble. We'll copy this from fill, put this in stroke, and there we are. We will focus on are the transitions. Svelte makes this super easy. If you import draw from Svelte Transitions. Going over to our path, let's give it a transition, draw. We're going to give it something called global. If you're doing transitions inside of an each in Svelte, they are scoped by default. So by giving it global, it allows it to interact with the state outside of that. Let's do a duration of 2000. If we look back at our original example, we can see that each one draws just slightly after the one before it. We can achieve this by using a delay, and we can tie this to the index. So we'll do I times 500. The transitions work when an element is unmounted and then mounted onto the DOM. So the problem here is that this is showing by default. Therefore, there's nothing to transition because it's already here. What we're actually going to do is hide this. And then once the page is loaded, we're going to show this, and that will allow us to do the transition. We're going to create a variable called show and set that to false. If it is false, we're not going to show our chart. So if show, and then close that off. Here we can see the chart goes away. As I mentioned, we want to change this to true once the screen is loaded. In doing that, it allows us to activate the transitions. Svelte is a function called onMount, which if you're used to React is the same as useEffect with empty brackets. It's something that runs as soon as the page is loaded. So we pop over here, we import onMount from Svelte, and then we'll run that. And in that function, we're going to set our show value to true. We can see our transitions work, but they're maybe a bit slow and awkward. Let's try decreasing the opacity on path and see if that improves anything. Oh, much better. Let's also make them faster. There we go. It's also quite odd that the bubbles show up while the stems are growing out. So maybe we can have these hide, and then once the stems reach them, they appear. To do that, we're going to add another transition called fade. We'll copy this setup here, except we're going to give it a delay of another second, so it doesn't appear until these reach it. Change draw to fade. Maybe a bit slow. Let's try to reduce this. Much better. We'll add this to the reflection, so that shows up too. Perfect. And that concludes our animated bouquet chart tutorial. I hope you learned something. If so, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. This is fairly adaptable to other frameworks, so let's say you want to try this in React or just vanilla JavaScript. Feel free to leave a comment below, and I could also add that to my GitHub for reference. Hope you enjoyed, and we will see you next time.